All right, we're moving into a section. It's chapter 8 on articulations. So term for joints. So starting out with a description of what a joint is. A joint, or of course also known as an articulation, this is just any location in the skeleton where you have at least two or more bones. So it's a minimum of two. And these multiple bones are just in close proximity. So for example, I'll make a little sketch. Here's one bone, and then here's the second bone meeting the minimum. And these two being together in close proximity, that's the description of a joint. So any and every joint of the body can be named by two different systems. So the first system that we notice here is describing truly the physiology, the flexibility of the joint. So describing the range of motion. And we'll take a look at three general divisions under this category for the flexibility. And the second way to name again that very same joint is now based on truly the anatomy. So the structure of that joint, and specifically, we're looking at what type of connective tissue connects those bones together and stabilizes that joint. So some specific type of connective tissue structure, and that's the anatomical groupings. And we'll spend more time and more focus, of course, on the anatomy of the joint. So starting out with the three general groups for the flexibility, there's a synarthrosis joint, meaning without motion. So these are joints that have no ability to move at their articulation. And a great example would be the sutures, the joints between our major skull bones. So as an adult, of course, which is key, as an adult, we can't have any flexibility between our, say, parietal bones of the cranium or temporal bone to parietal bone. So no motion, synarthrosis. Amphiarthrosis means there's just a limited range of flexibility, so a very slight give. And great examples would be the cartilage of the pelvis or the intervertebral discs from one vertebra to the next. So just a very slight, limited range of flexibility. And now the third grouping, again, based on function. This now is the most common of these three. So truly the large majority of the joints in our body are flexible, and that term is diarthrosis. So these are the truly flexible joints of the body. And of course, there's numerous examples. So as far as based on the flexibility, it's these three categories here: synarthrosis, amphiarthrosis, diarthrosis. And we'll see further examples of each of these. So again, synarthrosis meaning no motion. And again, right here, the sutures of the adult cranium are a great example. So at this point here, as an adult, there's no motion between the parietal and occipital bones. I say adult because at birth, the fetal skull still allows for some flexibility for delivery. Another example is the epiphyseal plate. So this is, of course, in a developing bone. And it's the fact that we have the bone structure of the diaphysis, the developing bone structure of the epiphysis, and these two distinct areas of bone tissue are bonded together by that epiphyseal plate, but there's no motion, no flexibility in this area. So even though it's internally inside of one bone, these two separate areas held close together fits that description, and there's no motion. Amphiarthrosis, where there's just a very limited range of flexibility, and here's that example of the intervertebral disc. So from one vertebra to the next, it's a very limited range of flexibility. But since we have a number of discs along the length of the spinal column, our entire spinal column does, of course, have flexibility. but from one vertebra to the next, it's still a limited range. And another example is what we see here as this now connection, this joint between the bones in the forearm. So just think about twisting your forearm just from the elbow and rotating. Again, that's just a limited range of how far we could really twist the elbow, fitting into that amphiarthrosis description. And then lastly, based on function, the truly flexible types of joints, diarthrosis. And if we take a look at this figure now, this is of course showing the anatomy of a diarthrosis joint. So we're looking at the structure. And a key reason why diarthrosis joints are so flexible is we see that these two areas of bone structures actually do not contact one another. Instead, there's this hollow cavity, this open space. And this is just an example, of course, of how this anatomical structure, having that joint cavity between the articulating bones, this structure is what allows for this wide range of flexibility, that diarthrosis function. So this is looking at just the first naming system for joints. And again, it truly comes down to just if there's no motion whatsoever, very limited range of motion, or the truly flexible diarthrosis joints. So now we're going to spend time with the structural classifications. So truly the anatomical names for the joint classification. And this is also seen in the lab activity 7. So it'll be nice to review that right along with this section here. So when it comes to the structural groupings, we see that there's 3 general subdivisions that we're focused on. So we'll start with the first one, fibrous joints. This now, of course, based on the type of connective tissue, these are now collagen-rich joints. So collagen fibers, that's now connecting these structures together and stabilizing these joints. And we'll see 3 specific examples of fibrous joints. Second group, the name makes it really clear. Some type of cartilage, so some particular type of cartilage is stabilizing that articulation. And we'll see 2 specific examples here. And then lastly, again, based on these 3 general categories under the structural classification, the most common of these 3 is the synovial type. And a synovial joint, its key structural trait, the bones of the joint are held together by what's called an articular capsule. And inside of that articular capsule, there's this liquid-filled joint cavity. And we'll definitely take a look at that structure as we move through. So starting with the fibrous examples, the collagen-rich structures that hold the bones together. Well, what's known as a suture type of joint, based on the structure, a suture joint, the type of connective tissue is, in this case, suture bone. Bone's definitely type of connective tissue. And suture bone is what bonds the larger cranial bones together. So based on that distinct type of connective tissue, that is the distinction of a suture joint. Syndesmosis, these are now, of course, connected together by the ligament structures. And what we're looking at here is just, of course, this specific type of ligament structure known as the interosseous membrane. But in general, just any ligamentous connection. And ligaments, of course, are made of dense, regular connective tissue. So the ligaments that now connect bone to bone, that's the syndesmosis joint. And a distinct type of ligament only seen for the teeth, what's known as a gomphosis joint. This is referring to the periodontal ligament, the ligaments that are connecting between the sockets on the mandible and maxilla and the teeth. So that's a unique case just for the teeth, nowhere else, gomphosis, but it truly comes down to another ligament structure. Moving on to the cartilaginous types, we see the term synchondrosis, and it's specifically hyaline cartilage in the joints. So a great example would be the costal cartilage, the hyaline cartilage between, you see here, the rib to the sternum. The hyaline cartilage at the epiphyseal plate, bonding the epiphysis to the diaphysis. Whereas now a symphysis cartilaginous joint, it's due to the fact specifically that it is fibrocartilage. So once again, we're seeing the distinct connective tissue that's bonding the bones together. And of course, the good example, we have the fibrocartilage here of the pelvis, or the fibrocartilage of our intervertebral discs. So at this point, we've worked through a lot of the structural types of joints. And this chart here from the textbook, and we'll work our way through this is putting the two different naving systems together. So let's just spend some time going through this here. We started out with the functional categories, synarthrosis when there's no movement, amphiarthrosis where there's just a limited range of movement, and then the diarthrosis, truly flexible joints. And now here at the rest of the table, we're looking at the structural types. And we're just now matching these together, because again, any joint could be named both ways. So different examples of synarthrosis joints, joints that have no motion. Well, when there's suture bone bonding the joint together, so we lack any flexibility at the adult skull. The gomphosis joints for our teeth. So our teeth are not moving in the sockets. Gomphosis has no motion. Another example we see here, the synchondrosis, the hyaline cartilage articulations. And we gave the example between the rib and the sternum. So this hyaline cartilage type of joint has no flexibility. And again, this last one down here is not one that we covered, so we don't have to worry about this. The amphiarthrosis, when there's just a very slight limited range of motion. We notice here the ligaments of our syndesmosis joints. So just that slight degree of flexibility. The same applies for our fibrocartilaginous joints. So the symphysis pubis, for example, the intervertebral discs, composed of that fibrocartilage pad, giving a slight degree of flexibility. And now we notice here the two that we haven't used before, the diarthrosis flexibility always matches to the synovial anatomy. And again, we haven't gotten into the details yet. We will in just a moment. But our synovial joints are the ones that have that articular capsule bonding them together and the hollow fluid-filled joint cavity within. And that's what we want to discuss now. So we're back to referencing this figure, you notice. This is showing the structure of a synovial joint, but it matches to the flexibility of a diarthrosis joint. So again, the major traits are it has this open cavity between the bones. So since there's not a direct fusion between the different elements, that allows for much more flexibility. And what actually holds the joint together is the articular capsule structure with its two different components. So as we take a look at the joint itself, it's held together by the articular capsule. The superficial strong structure stabilizing the joint is that fibrous capsule. And the internal lining of that is a liquid producing synovial membrane, the source of the fluid that circulates inside of the cavity, the source of the synovial fluid. And of course, the bones that are now participating in that joint, they're now capped in their own layer of articular cartilage. So that remaining hyaline cartilage from our endochondral development, and this cartilage functions as a protective pad. So as the bones and the joints do tap against one another, that's now there to protect the bones from damage. So we have that protective padding there right within the joint. And the fluid itself also helps to protect the bones. And that's what we see here. The synovial fluid that fills this cavity, so with the liquid circulating between the bones, that also reduces the trauma when the bones do touch against one another. And again, this articular cartilage being avascular, it still needs a nutrient source for the cartilage cells. And since we now pointed out that synovial joints all have that diarthrosis flexibility, for all of these moving parts, we have now this lubrication, this fluid for these moving, very flexible components. We'll now continue on with what's known as accessory structures. These are now all additional elements that may or may not be found in select synovial joints. So starting with what's known as a meniscus, is the singular form of the word. A meniscus is a structure composed of fibrocartilage, and we see that the meniscus here in terms of the knee, this fibrocartilage structure sits right inside of the joint cavity, so filling some of the space of the joint cavity. So it is dividing the cavity, and it's also reducing the flexibility of the knee joint. The benefit, however, is by restricting the flexibility, it's increasing the stability of the joint. And that's something we definitely need at the knee joint to stand up. So it's making it more stable by reducing the flexibility. Ligaments and tendons, just a simple description. Ligaments connecting bone to bone. So from one bone feature to another bone feature. Tendons connecting from muscle to bone. So that's the general descriptions for those two terms. But these are both composed of dense, regular, connective tissue. A bursae on this illustration here of the shoulder, they're seen here in green. So all these different green elements that you're seeing on this figure. And bursae, they're found, of course, surrounding the very flexible synovial joints. And they produce a similar joint fluid, that synovial fluid. And for these moving parts, as you flex and extend your shoulder, for example, it gives now a moist surface for our tendons to now move across. So this is just simply lubrication for the moving parts, in this case specifically the tendons. And this is protecting the tendons, of course, from friction, from wear and tear. So to finish this section with the joints, just kind of reinforcing this again, all of our synovial joints, and you can see from this figure, there's actually a diversity in various shapes of synovial joints. But all synovial joints have that diarthrosis flexibility. So the much more commonly flexed and moved, much more movable joints have that synovial anatomy to them. Now we'll take a look at the spinal column. And viewing the spine from this lateral view, we can see that there are these natural curves to the developed adult spine. And in contrast, we'll talk about some abnormalities. So this first one here, it is quite common, scoliosis. You notice here we're viewing the spine from the dorsal side. And from this dorsal view, there's this abnormal lateral curvature to the spine. So whether it goes to the right or left, that's not the important trait. It could be askew either side. But that there's some type of lateral curvature to the spine, and it's more commonly seen in the thoracic and lumbar regions. In severe cases, it's even seen in the cervical area. And this is commonly seen as a birth defect. So we see that curvature to the spine in whichever way it happens to curve. But now, since the ribs connect to the thoracic vertebrae, you can see the rib cage is askew, and even the shoulder blades would be askew as well. Lordosis, another example of a spinal defect. There is, again, that natural degree of lumbar curvature that we see in an adult. The issue with lordosis is a really exaggerated, excessive lumbar curve. The common cause for this is weight gain in the abdominal region, and that ends up pulling with that pressure forward, increasing and pronouncing that lumbar curve, and it leads to the appearance of a protruding gluteal region. And a third example, kyphosis. Again, there is a natural curvature in the thoracic region of the spine. And again, it's just an excessive thoracic curvature that's very pronounced. And this could occur due to weakening of bones. So with advanced age, with calcium and mineral loss, it leads to that hunched back appearance. And here's some photographs from the textbook showing now people with these different conditions. So again, that extreme thoracic curvature and kyphosis. Again, right here, a pregnant woman, an example of the lordosis condition. And here, seeing somebody, a patient with scoliosis. And the last few notes to finish up this section. We do have these intervertebral discs, as we see here, between the vertebrae, specifically the area called the vertebral body. However, between the first two superior vertebrae, between cervical 1 and cervical number 2, between atlas and axis, there's no intervertebral disc present. We have this bony structure here dividing our nasal cavity, and this is known as a nasal septum. This bony structure is made from the fusion of two distinct bones, the inferior portion of the septum coming from the vomer, and the superior portion of the septum. The name of the bone is ethmoid bone, and the distinct landmark, the distinct piece of that is the perpendicular plate. And those two bond together to now make that full nasal septum. The term bony orbit, this refers to the bones that make up the eye socket, and it's a total of 7 bones that contribute. And here was a mnemonic that I learned for this right here, the please feed my zebra, and that spells out right here. So the palatine bone, the lacrimal bone, ethmoid bone, sphenoid bone, frontal bone. It could be called maxillary bone or maxilla, and the zygomatic bones. So all of those together make that eye socket structure, the bony orbit. And to finish up here, there's this term calvaria. It would translate to skull cap. It's not a natural anatomical structure, but when we do dissect and open up the cranium, when we saw off the top portion, just depending on where it's cut, all of that area that's superior to that cut is now known as the calvaria.